And so welcome everyone. This is part of our continuing classes on this wonderful text, the 37 practices of a Bodhisattva. But even if you haven't come to previous classes, don't worry. It's, something I can get you situated in terms of the content. Let's go ahead and begin as we usually do with just a few prayers. And again, in Buddhism, our prayers are really just to kind of align our minds in a particular direction. And we usually begin with reciting this prayer that's a praise to the Buddha, the historical Buddha who lived about 2,500 years ago. And we're just recalling his amazing qualities and how much we're indebted to the Buddha for sharing these teachings. So did you want to share the prayers, Stella? Did you want to lead them?
Yeah, I was going to.
I'll get some copies for folks. It might be hard to read on the screen, but
I can't read it, so.
Yeah, we do have copies, hard copies, if you prefer to use that. So if you wouldn't mind then leading us in that, Stella, that would be great. We recite this 3 times.
So the founder,
the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one beyond, the destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, the knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
To the
Founder of the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one God beyond, the co-destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one God beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, the knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Oops, sorry. There we go.
Short Mandela once in English.
This realm, anointed with perfumes, strewn with flowers, adored with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon.
I
imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this realm.
And taking refuge in generating bodhicitta, once in English and twice in Tibetan. I go
for refuge in the light of light, the Buddha, the Dharma, the system by the merits of the Creator, listening to the Dharma. May I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Chodam Soki Choknam Lam, Chokchu Bardu Dharmi Kyapsuchi, Dagi Chanir Gepe Sonangi, Yola Penchu Sangye Jupansho. Swangye Chodam Soki Choknam Lam, Chokchu Bardu Dharmi Kyapsuchi, Dagi Chanir Gepe Sonangi, Hey, thank you, Stella. Thank you all. As usual, we're going to do just a short meditation, and I'd like to proceed the class with a meditation just so we have a chance to focus our minds a bit, let go of whatever distractions we might have from our day. We all had, no doubt, somewhat busy days, so it's good to spend a little time in stillness and silence and to focus the mind a bit. So use the breath as a meditation object, or if you have another meditation object you prefer, you can do that. But essentially try to bring your awareness to the breath in whatever way you prefer to work with the breath. If you need a suggestion, you might work with the area around the nostrils, where you feel the air coming in and out as you inhale and exhale. Just stay present with that very subtle sensation in that area as best as you can, with the mind somewhat relaxed. You're not tightening the mind. You're just holding your awareness there very gently. And whenever you see that the mind has wandered, we get thoughts popping into our mind or what have you that have taken us away from the breath, let go of those and bring the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl here in the gompa to begin the meditation. We'll do a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection just to strengthen that motivation of bodhicitta that we just recited in that prayer. So we can begin now. So now let's set our motivation for tonight's class. Let's just recall that very simple fact that the Buddha started with. All the Buddha's teachings revolve around this idea that all beings, just like ourselves, fundamentally desire two things. One is to have happiness, and the other is to be free from suffering. And the Buddha says this is just the way things are. This is how our minds are driven. And we can see this playing out in our own lives, the lives of other beings we know, even beings in the animal world that gravitate towards what brings some measure of happiness or safety, moving away from things that threaten their lives or bring them danger. This is what all beings are driven by. And of course, the Buddha's observation is that in spite of that, beings have not yet figured out how to find true happiness, nor have they been able to free themselves from all suffering. So everything the Buddha taught is to help beings to attain the peace, the happiness that they seek, to not have to experience any dissatisfaction, suffering, pain, what have you. So anytime we come to the Buddha's teachings, that's the starting point. A recognition of our own dissatisfaction we experience, the pain, the difficulties, the problems, and a wish, a desire to find real peace, real happiness. And in setting our motivation, we're working with the idea that is a part of this text. The ideal of a bodhisattva, a being who is dedicated to helping all beings to achieve the happiness they desire and to be free from all suffering. This is vast mind, a mind that is embracing all sentient beings with love and compassion, and moreover, a kind of courageous conviction that we need to dedicate our lives to the welfare of all beings. That's the main aspiration in bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, the mind of enlightenment, the wish to benefit all sentient beings. But we also bring to mind the fact that we cannot do this in our current state. We lack the qualifications, the capability. Therefore, we have to become more capable. We have to develop our own minds and hearts. The state of Buddhahood, the state the Buddha himself attained, and that we all can attain. Every being has the potential to eventually attain the state of enlightenment. So cultivate that mind now, the mind that wishes to benefit all beings, and moreover, wants to become a Buddha ourselves, so we can do that perfectly for others. Generate that motivation for engaging in these teachings that give us all the practices we need to engage in order to become a Buddha ourselves. It's important we have that motivation of bodhicitta to accompany the teachings we're going into tonight. So just rest in that mind of bodhicitta for a moment. That sincere desire to benefit all beings by becoming enlightened yourself. And then you can open your eyes gradually and come back into the space together. So again, in this text, this is a wonderful text from Tokme Zampo. It goes back to like the 13th, 14th century, long time ago in Tibet. This amazing practitioner who was the embodiment of this bodhisattva ideal himself. We've been going through the verses here, and we're in this section just to kind of get everybody in the ballpark here of what we're looking at. In this particular section, we're focusing on this one technique that is used within what are called the mind training teachings, the Lojong teachings in Tibet, These are ways that we use everything we meet as an opportunity to go deeper into our own practice. And in particular, we're mainly looking at in this section problems, difficulties. I'm guessing every one of us who's here today has problems of some sort or another. You have something going on in your life or have had other things going on in your life that were problematic for you. And of course, we're trying to examine our more habitual ways of reacting to those problems and replacing it with a new framework, a new way of initially at least looking at them as opportunities, amazing opportunities for us to deepen our practice. And then, of course, to learn from each of these ones that are set out. There's a number of them that we go through. It's about 10 verses in total, and we're just about halfway through these verses right now. Let me go ahead and put on the screen the outline for this section. That is not there. It's this one. Okay. This outline is called in total Transforming Unfavorable Circumstances into the Path during the post-meditation period, meaning, okay, we meditate on cultivating love and compassion for others and what have you. When we're up off our cushion and we're going about our daily life, there are many things that happen to us. There are distressing events, there are difficulties, there are various things that can happen in our lives, and we need to be ready to work with those, not kind of, run away from them or react in the more habitual ways by getting angry, upset, and what have you. How do we actually embrace those problems? Remember when I introduced this topic, well, it was towards the beginning of looking at this topic, I talked about how Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, said there are essentially two main minds that we have to develop in regard to this practice. The first one is stopping having this resistance to problems. We tend to think that whenever a problem comes up, we have to do everything in our ability to get away from it, to not have to go through it, to not have to deal with it. That's kind of, again, the way that most people deal with their problems. But the Bodhisattva wants to deal with problems in a different way, wants to actually see problems as a very important opportunity, again, for us to practice. So that's the first one, is stop having this incredible resistance to problems and difficulties in our lives. Doesn't mean we create more for ourselves. It means that while we have them coming into our lives, use them well. The second mind that we want to develop is a mind that even likes problems, which is outrageous, right? So these teachings were actually secret in Tibet for many, many years because people are not used to practicing this way, to say, oh, good, I've got a problem in my life. How wonderful, how joyous. We're going to even examine a little teaching that comes from Tokme Zangpo, our author, that's not a part of our text, a little bit later tonight, that gives us that advice about cultivating joy when we have problems or difficulties in our life. And that's pretty outrageous. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says we should learn to like our problems the same way we like ice cream. So think about ice cream or cake or whatever it is that you like. Do you like your problems that much? Probably not. And that's okay. That's what we're trying to get habituated to working with and to changing our minds. So this whole section, go back and put that on the screen again, it deals with various situations. The first four that we've gone through already have to do with what is called here distressing events, difficult times in our lives when we have loss, particularly physical loss, where someone steals from you, takes things that are yours that weren't offered to them, get robbed, or even, nowadays with identity theft, you can have so many different ways that people can steal something of yours. The second one is when you have physical suffering, when actually things are happening to you that are inflicted upon you by other beings, can be human beings, could be insects, could be, whatever, the variety of beings that are in our world. The third and the fourth have to do with these things that we're really quite preoccupied with, kind of not being blamed or having any sort of slander directed at us and what have you. And we're also not really fond of criticism, right? These are things that most people have some resistance to experience. When others are criticizing them or blaming them for the things that they've done, these are ways that we need to work with those situations to actually try to dismantle some of the defenses we have against those things and to really work with having more compassion for others when they are doing these things. And all four of these that are in that first part of the list are ones where we do practice this idea of having compassion for those who are harming us, those who are saying things that we don't want to hear or causing us physical suffering or stealing from us, which too is outrageous in our world. Usually we want to lock people up as soon as they're accused of something that they've done to harm us or those that we love. We want to reverse that attitude. Last week, we started this next set of two, or it's just called here transforming difficulties, but these are things that may happen to us that are a little more intricate. The one that we looked at last week is on ingratitude. Maybe I'll share the verse for that. And tonight we're going to go into derision, where people are kind of being very speaking poorly of us and what have you, putting us down, especially people who we see as kind of lower than ourselves. But if we go to the text, and again, you have all of these handouts that I'm showing on the screen here. All of these are available by going to the website for the center, and there's a little place to click on where you can go to the Google page, Google Docs that I have set these all up on. Let's go back to verse 16, and you can take a look at the one that had to do with ingratitude. Even if a person whom they dearly protected like their own child looks upon them as an enemy, it is a practice of Conqueror's children, Bodhisattvas, to be especially merciful and kind to that person, like a mother for her child afflicted by illness. So again, just to review briefly, when we looked at that verse, the idea was that when you have someone whom you have taken care of greatly, you've tended to, you've nurtured, you've done everything for them, bent over backwards for them, and they end up harming you. Well, again, this is one of the hardest things we have to deal with in these human lives, right? And especially parents who maybe had children who abandoned them, left them for whatever reason, or maybe vice versa, where parents have abandoned children. Whenever you have somebody who you're very close to in your life, and you know that the expectation in society is that you're going to have some feeling of gratitude for that person, some appreciation for them in your life, and you're going to act from that place. Well, in this case, they do the exact opposite. When they do the opposite and express ungratitude, or is that a word? Ungratefulness? I got gratefulness would be more appropriate word. They have ungratefulness towards you, and they do things even that harm you. Well, this is really hard to accept, right? And most people would give you the advice of, well, have nothing to do with them then. Look, develop even hatred towards them because they've done these things towards you. The Bodhisattva is going to do things differently. The Bodhisattva is actually going to see that person as an incredible opportunity for us to try to keep our hearts open, to generate some desire to be a benefit to them, to be kind to them. They use the example here at the last line, like a mother for her child afflicted by illness. This is pointing to the fact that when we see others engaged in such behavior, when they're treating us like an enemy, when we've treated them as our dearest friend, well, then we can understand that the reason why they're doing that is because it's as if they're afflicted by an illness. The illness of the delusions, the afflictions themselves, the states of mind that cause beings to behave in such selfish ways. And they're only thinking about themselves, they're not thinking of others, and therefore they're treating you really poorly. So you see that the mind states, the mental states that these beings have are the problem. They themselves are not the problem. So we want to treat them with kindness and compassion and care and concern while trying to help them address these states of mind that are problematic. And sometimes we can do that, sometimes we can't. But at least we don't close our hearts to those beings. We say, okay, they're behaving this way because they're under the control of their own crazy minds right now. That's not really who they are, the deepest level. And we can have, again, that equal concern for them, that regard for them, it's not conditioned on what they do to us. We use this phrase in our culture a lot of unconditional love. It's a very difficult thing to cultivate, right? Because we see how quickly our minds change when somebody who we like and have cared for does something that is totally opposite to them. I remember when I was quite young, in high school, I liked to go to concerts, and that was the big thing. And there was one concert where all my friends got tickets together and they didn't get me a ticket. I was like really upset. I broke off the friendship with them, right? It was like, you all were really horrible in doing this to me, right? I don't know. In Buddhist terms, that was my karma from something I must have done that was of an equal, despicable nature. But the idea is that when we have people who we're very close to and they do something that flies in the face of our own interests, we often react in that way of like, hey, then I want nothing to do with you all. I hate you. I despise you. Get out of here. Whatever terms we might use. Well, the Bodhisattva is going to do the exact opposite thing because they once more are understanding why these beings are behaving that way. And that's the case for all of these various scenarios where people are doing things that harm you. They're doing things in harmony because they're under the control of their own crazy minds. We know our own crazy minds from having examined them. I did a whole course here on getting to know your mind, right? Where we look at kind of all the crazy roommates that we have in our minds that are doing all the various things that cause us to be jealous and prideful and angry and, hateful and miserly and all these various mind states. Well, we know that we have them. Why do we expect others aren't going to have them? They have them as well, and they might manifest in ways that harm us. Well, but we understand why that is happening then. There's at least a context. We're not equating the person with their deluded mental state. We're not making those equal. We're saying, okay, they have a mental state that's arising for various factors. Who they are as a person, we can actually still hold in compassion, with a mind of love. So this is what we're looking at in this previous verse that we looked at last week. Talks about that situation. We're experiencing ungratefulness. The other situation that is kind of difficult to bear, or that is a really challenging situation for us, is when others treat us with contempt. And as I said, this is particularly people who you see through whatever lens as being somewhat inferior to you. And this happens maybe with parents and their children, because children are generally not as intelligent and have the life experience that parents do. And so when your child might say something to you, that's, kind of giving you advice or putting you down or whatever, you might think, well, what do you know? Our pride rises up at that time. So let's see what the verse says, and then we'll go further into this. Even though a being equal to or inferior to them treats them with contempt out of pride, it is a practice of conquerors' children to respectfully take that person to the crown of their head like a guru, meaning we kind of treat them as somebody who's giving us the most incredible lesson. We've seen this idea of seeing others as a guru come up before. The idea of like a guru or lama, a teacher, is that on our path, we do need beings who challenge us in that way, who have greater qualities than us, who can look at us and say, guess what? You have some things to learn here, and I'm going to help you learn them. And sometimes that's difficult because they might be pointing out our faults and helping us to address those. But what a guru is then somebody who is demonstrating that type of behavior, somebody who's treating us this way, who we see as lowly and inferior to us, and they're actually out of their own pride and feeling of superiority or having contempt and scorn for us. They're a wonderful teacher for us because they show our own pride and our own tendency to kind of think that we're superior to others. What are you doing telling me that? That's, none of your business. We have those kinds of responses to people who might scorn us or treat us in that way. So let's see what Geshe Jampa Gyatso, this commentary we're using for this text as we go through it, is from my teacher in Italy when he taught on it, went to the teachings he gave on this text. His name is Geshe Jampa Gyatso, which, by the way, in Tibetan, that means ocean of love. It's kind of a nice name for somebody. For my teacher, who is, yes, a very loving being. Anyway, he says, even though a being equal to or inferior to you in class, body, prosperity, and so forth, there are a variety of things where someone could be inferior to us or even equal to us, right? All the different criteria that we use to discriminate ourselves being better, them being worse, what have you. So this person who is equal or inferior, they treat you with various kinds of scorn and contempt out of their own pride, their own feeling of superiority to you. Do not become angry with that person. But not only that, in addition, respectfully bowing your three doors, your body, speech, and mind, to that person as if they were your kind guru. You should take that person to the crown of your head, meaning kind of see them in a very superior position as someone giving you this invaluable lesson. This is the practice of conquerors' children, of carrying contempt into the path. This idea of carrying things into the path means we're going to take what we are experiencing from someone else, again, and we're going to help develop our own qualities that we want to generate on this Bodhisattva path, to use what somebody is doing to us as an opportunity to open our own hearts and minds. So in this case in particular, again, we're seeing that there is this opportunity for us to diminish our own feeling of superiority when someone else who we see as inferior or equal is acting in this way. And moreover, to perhaps even learn from that person. If somebody is scorning us, saying something negative about us, well, maybe there's even some truth to that. We looked at this idea last week as well. We were talking about how people might be saying things about you, exposing your faults to others. That was the example we used last week, right? In one of the earlier verses. Well, there might be some truth to those things, right? If we hear people talking about our faults, we might get upset and angry at first, but if we really examine it, there may be some substance to what they're saying. Maybe what they're saying is actually something we need to work on. Then how wonderful. It's like they're holding up a mirror to us and we can go, oh, wow, I've got some things I need to work on. Thank you very much. That's the idea of kind of seeing them as a teacher, seeing them as somebody who actually helps us to see our faults and correct them with generating greater qualities. That's what a teacher does for us. And if we have a teacher that isn't doing that for us, well, maybe we need to find one that does that for us. I know I've had some students who look at me in that light of being one of their teachers, and I'm not so good sometimes at like pointing out other people's faults or trying to get them to see things about themselves. And sometimes when I've done that with people, I'm kind of upset. Maybe I need to find a better way of doing it. I haven't developed the skill yet to do that. It's hard to really do that with a very positive mind. But in this case, maybe we're experiencing it from a negative state of mind. Somebody out of their own pride is putting us down, dealing with us with contempt, making us feel bad about ourselves or what have you. So in this case, again, we have to think about the kindness of that being in doing that for us, regardless of their intention. We did speak about the kindness of others in an earlier part of this course. Remember that when we define kindness in Buddhism in terms of how we are receiving kindness, it doesn't mean that that person is intentionally kind in the way that we talk about in our conventional language, right? In conventional language, kind means somebody is doing something really nice for us, buying us flowers or taking us to lunch or all those sorts of things that we enjoy, right? You can be experiencing the kindness of another being who's actually doing something very negative towards you. Why? Because you can choose to see it as somebody helping you to work on deepening your own qualities. If somebody's being really rude to you, that's a perfect opportunity for you to say, how can I develop more patience and tolerance of people who are like this, who behave in this way? How can I generate compassion and love for beings who treat me in that way? Those kind of help us move in a different direction and help us to stretch and go beyond our boundaries right now, where we tend to close down and get very defensive whenever anybody is intentionally unkind according to conventional terms. We can choose to see it as a kindness. And we can also, of course, just acknowledge the kindness of other beings in terms of the world around us. We don't live in complete isolation with nobody contributing to our welfare. All beings contribute to our welfare, in some indirect way. So we are, again, wanting to treat others with kindness, open up our, hearts and minds towards them so that we can, kind of hold them in that regard, kind of put them on the crown of our head. When they do this in Tibetan Buddhism, kind of putting a being to the crown of your head means that you're seeing them in a very superior position as somebody who you can learn from. We do this often visualizing our gurus on the crown of our head and receiving blessings from them and so on. So the idea here is that with this verse that we're looking at, when somebody behaving in this way, this is a great teaching for us. I want to share a little quote from Thupten Chodron. Venerable Chodron is a nun in our tradition, and she's written a commentary. I didn't bring all my books with me. I try not to cart everything up here from Santa Fe, but she wrote a book called Don't Believe Everything You Think, which is a great bumper sticker, right? We've probably all seen it on the back of cars, right? Don't believe everything you think. It's a wonderful Buddhist phrase because we think a lot of garbage. I hate to say it. I think a lot of garbage. We all think a lot of garbage. We're not thinking correctly all the time. And these teachings are actually, many of them, helping us to think differently, right? We've already seen that with these verses that we've just looked at, where we have an opportunity to reframe the situation, to see it in a very different light. That is actually more in line with what is going on. Like I said, if we see somebody treating us with contempt, well, we can choose to see them as somebody who's under the control of their own afflicted states of mind. That is what's actually happened. Yes, they haven't learned the tools to address that and change their minds. They haven't been able to kind of do that deeper work, but all the more reason then to have compassion for them because they have not yet been able to correct their own mind. So we have, again, ways of reframing it. Anyway, venerable children, she says, in terms of the teaching that you might be gaining from somebody in this case, they are showing us the foolishness of being proud ourselves and of being attached to our good qualities. Perhaps the reason this person is disparaging us is because we acted puffed up, thinking we are better than that person is. They're pointing out to us that humility, not arrogance, is a quality of a bodhisattva. So while we see someone manifesting pride and putting us down, that's a mirror again for us to look at our own pride. Because that's often what gets in the way. They often say pride is one of the worst obstacles for our spiritual development. Because if we think that we are such great, and we're such hot stuff, we're such wonderful practitioners that we aren't willing to learn from others, then we're blocking off a whole avenue of developing our minds because we're not willing to bring those situations in and really work with them. There's a wonderful verse. I've quoted a couple of these verses from Geshe Langri Tangpa, who preceded Tokme Sangpo by a couple of centuries. He wrote the very first mind training or Lojong text, and it's called the 8 Verses of Thought Transformation or Mind Training. And it's verse 2 that says, when in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest among all and respectfully hold others dear and supreme. So the idea behind that, I mean, when you first hear it, the ego, when it hears it, it's like, you want me to do what? You want me to see myself as the lowest of all? You want me to see myself as like dirt on the ground and everybody else is superior? Well, yeah, in a way, yes. But the idea is that we're really trying to practice humility, being in the presence of others, and really trying to see what they can, contribute to our well-being and how we might contribute to theirs. Almost to kind of see ourselves as somewhat of a servant of others, kind of serving others with the best intentions, always wanting to be a benefit to them. So when people are pointing out our faults or saying contemptful things, towards us, things that we don't like to hear that are disparaging us and what have you, we can see that person as, again, something we can hold up and say, oh, you're going to teach me a lesson. You're going to be like my teacher, my guru. I can learn from you. How wonderful. What an incredible gift. Again, we use that idea of seeing them through the lens of this type of kindness. It's not a kindness that your friends often give you, and maybe they occasionally do that, but most of your friends probably treat you really well, right? Other than in that last verse when we saw how our friends can sometimes turn on us, but essentially, most people don't challenge us in that way. We need people like this who treat us with contempt in order to see where our buttons get pushed, where our own pride rises up, where we get defensive when somebody does these sorts of things towards us, right? Points it all out for us so we can work on it then. Because once more, the Bodhisattva is intent on taming their own minds, changing their own minds. And the goal, of course, is always to be of greatest benefit to others. Well, how can you benefit others if when someone treats you with contempt, you treat them back with equal contempt, or you do something even worse to harm them? But that's not the mind of a bodhisattva at all. So again, this framing of it in this way that Venerable Children talks about, like this is actually a teacher who's pointing out to us our own prideful mind, our own ways of following our delusions in situations like that, that are the source of so much pain for ourselves, and they keep us stuck. And if anything, maybe even going backward because we just generate more and more pride. So again, this is an opportunity to reframe that situation, to really look at how can I look at that person now as somebody who I would maybe not like yet. I mean, that advice from Lama Zopa, maybe we don't like them like ice cream yet, people who treat us with contempt, but we at least are not going to be resistant to that happening. We're going to say, okay, I can learn from this. I can work with this. And if you find, and we did look at this idea earlier when we looked at the verse on slander, some people may say things about you that are untrue. Well, those are really hard because you don't learn anything if we necessarily have those faults in ourselves. But nonetheless, we can still see how the ego pops up and wants to defend itself and, not acknowledge that we have anything to work on. So we may not have that specific thing to work on, but we still have something to work on that's coming up in our own defensiveness. So again, this whole path of learning that we're on, every opportunity presents, or everything we meet presents some sort of opportunity to work with him. And we can also recall, like we saw with that other verse that we just looked at earlier tonight, in verse 16, where the other person is under the control of their own delusions when they're doing this. And it's not a nice thing to treat others with contempt, right? That behavior is not good for that being to engage in. So have the mind that really sees them through the lens of compassion, that sees that they're under the control of their own delusions at that time. And remember, you can always, in this verse, some of the verses coming up will mention this practice again. You can always practice Tonglen at these times, as well as any of the other ways of transforming that situation. But Tonglen is the main practice of the Bodhisattva. And just to recap, what you do in Tonglen is you are taking away the suffering of that being, and you are giving them your happiness, which is, again, the total opposite to what we normally do. We're like, give away all the garbage and we'll take all the happiness for ourselves. This is the Bodhisattva ethic doing the exact opposite. I'm going to take away your suffering. So when we have somebody treating us with this contempt, they're creating karmic patterns that they'll experience contempt towards them on the basis of that behavior or other ramifications in their life. So we want to take away that future suffering, or even the suffering of being under the control of delusions and saying such scornful things towards us. So we're taking their suffering away and being willing and glad to experience it ourselves so they can be free of it. And we're giving what we have so they can have a mind that is at peace, a mind that is happy, have all the qualities of the path, to develop in their own hearts and minds. So this is the total, again, reversal of our habitual tendency to think of ourselves first, only get what we want for ourselves and give away the bad part. Here we're going to take on the bad part and be willing to experience it and give them the good part. Take on their suffering and give them our happiness. Again, revolutionary practice. And I introduce these with every sort of warning, that this is not something you might be ready to engage in immediately. That's okay. Just work with it gradually, and gradually our heart opens up more and more, and we become more and more willing to engage in that type of practice. But again, Tonglen can be practiced in any of these situations. We can look at others and see that they are suffering on the basis of what's going on in their own minds. So again, one thing I want to point out while we're more or less done with verse 17, though I want to open it up and see if anyone wants to share anything in regard to their own experiences around people treating them in this way. But I put together for each of these classes some questions for contemplation, which may help you to investigate these topics a little further. For carrying contempt into the path, and by the way, these tend to look somewhat similar. I just changed the wording of the particular problem you're working with. But for this one, it says, when was the last time that someone whom you considered inferior, or could be equal, the verse said equal or inferior, but someone who's, again, you might see as not in a position where they should be putting you down or treating you with scorn. When was the last time something like that happened, even in a very cursory way? Right? Sometimes we just go about our business and maybe somebody at the bank or somebody at the grocery store treats us in a way that we think, how dare they treat me like that? I'm so much better than them or something. All those thoughts that we have in our mind, right? Or are we really that much better because we're treating them in the same way that they're treating us? So anyway, it says, how did you think about that occurrence then? What were the thoughts you had? And not beat ourselves up on the basis of that or feel guilty, but then to look at it from the realm of possibility of what does it feel like to reframe that situation in the light of the advice given by Tokme Sangpo, which was in this case to, again, maybe diminish our own pride and hold that being at this place of superiority as if they were a guru, as if they were a teacher for us. As Venerable Children said, they're giving us this amazing teaching. How wonderful. And then I put in parentheses there, or other ways to transform that experience of contempt or scorn into the path, such as Tonglen, or some of the other practices I looked at. I won't review all of those tonight. They're in the earlier teachings, but essentially there are ways that we can use whatever we're experiencing to help us to generate some understanding of this path to Buddhahood, which entails working on correcting our own minds, liberating ourselves of our faults, and developing our own qualities. Compassion, loving kindness, wisdom, generosity, all these amazing qualities that we can develop to an infinite degree. Any questions or comments that people want to share? Again, I want to kind of move these classes somewhat into a bit of a discussion. I don't know if discussion is quite the right word, but if people have any reflections from your own experience of working with something like this that you're willing to share, then the floor is open. Those on Zoom, just put your little hand icon up and I'll call on you. Those who are in the room here, just raise your hand. Yes, Betty.
It's this is hitting me pretty hard because I went through something, and it's always when it's with your family, someone that you love, someone that loves you, and something comes up and it's real hard. Then your mind kind of takes over, right?
Sure.
But what I've realized with myself through the years, and then it gets harder when it's very intimate like that. But when your child comes and is saying these things to you, and the ego pops up. What I've realized is sometimes because of reflection, but sometimes it's because I need to let that go. There's a charge in it, and I need to let that go. Else it would flow over me like water, So, and that sometimes, so I don't know if that's the same, is kind of what you were saying, but it's a lot of self-forgiveness and kind of even saying, okay, you need to let this go. This is a belief that's within yourself. Else it would just flow. It wouldn't have had that charge.
Right.
And my ego wouldn't have, pressed up against her so much. I would have just, I would have been able to be more compassionate in the moment and more loving.
Yeah.
I don't know. So
I mean, what you're speaking to, Beverly, is that we have to kind of be willing to see our own painful reactions at what's going on around us in these situations, and kind of acknowledge that, this is not something that we want to kind of further and especially reinforce the habitual reactions we have coming from that place of pain.
The bad self-talk, and you realize how much you're not in the moment, and that you're still holding on to that.
Exactly.
So it was a huge growing experience, one that I didn't even know all that stuff was back there, I didn't know it was back there. But
this is a very courageous path to be willing to look at that stuff and to take ownership of it, and again, not react in the habitual ways, but to really see it as kind of a touchstone to be able to connect with the suffering of others and to see the situation in, again, a very different light. Which reminds me that I actually did have a little passage I wanted to share towards the beginning of tonight that I forgot to do, from Ken MacLeod, who I brought into the class a number of times. He has his commentary on this text. And maybe this speaks to a little bit of what you're saying, Beverly, because it reminded me of this passage. He says, many people just pay lip service to these instructions. They retreat into an idealization of what it means to be a bodhisattva. They use the behavioral codes to mask their own anger and hurt, and do not let themselves feel the intensity of their own pain, let alone the pain of the world. We all carry pain. We all carry these charges, like you said, that happen to us that do have some power to them, some energy to them that we need to work with. He says that's understandable. It is often unthinkably frightening to experience what goes on inside you. If you wish to be free, however, you have no choice. We do have to open our hearts and our minds to what is going on in the mental landscape of our own lives and see these things. And again, not so that we then keep acting in the same way, kind of do that insane thing of just expecting things to go differently when we keep saying and doing the same things. We have to see that as, once more, that's an opportunity to touch very deeply the suffering of others by seeing our own pain and suffering, to be willing to open to that. And then in that way, connect with others from a very different place, like you said, a place of compassion, loving kindness, and care and concern. It's a long process. It's not something we can flip a switch. I wish we had switches like this. Maybe Amazon will sell them one day or something where we could just order them online and install them. And then suddenly, we're totally compassionate, caring, and kind, not reacting in any of these, angry ways and whatnot. We have to do the work on ourselves. And that's going to be the case, I think, forever. It means being very honest with ourselves and looking once more at the pain we experience and recognizing we have a choice there of how we're going to work with that. We have to work with it. If you don't work with it, you're never going to get through it. And so, I don't know, does that relate somewhat to what you're saying?
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing that and being honest.
Yeah, it's like I said, I'm sort of, I was supposed to be here tonight.
This one came up for you.
Yeah.
It was your number. Yes, really.
I relate to this a lot because I feel like I deal with this in my job a lot, the kind of contempt from students, especially because I see all grades from K through 5.
Wow.
And it's difficult to put into practice. I feel like it's maybe not so hard when it's just words and it's just you and another person, but when it's a child and they're doing something that's that they're doing something that's either going to hurt themselves or hurt others, or it's going to serve as an example. If I don't cut the situation, it'll spread.
Right.
And then it becomes like a really bad issue. To be able to keep that in the back of my mind while I'm still trying to correct the situation.
Right. Because that is true. I mean, we don't want to make it such that our practice becomes something that facilitates other people's misbehavior.
Right.
Because you have a role to play there, particularly in the authority role that you have as a teacher, and they are your students. So there is a need to play that role because that is helpful to the students to develop their own self-discipline, to have some awareness of themselves in relation to others and how they are behaving and how that can have an effect on others. So it's not to say that we don't do those things, but we have to always go back to what's our motivation for doing it. We can do the internal work when we're outside of the classroom and go, okay, what was it like for me as I heard that child saying these scornful words towards me, and what was going on, and work with that on our cushion and in our own investigation. But in the classroom, it's a very different thing that needs to be managed with an underlying motivation of compassion and concern, not anger and upset and all the things that we would, might have. Really feeling like the reason why you're disciplining children and saying things to them that lessen this type of behavior is because you care about them. You want them to be more responsible citizens of the world and doing things that are kinder towards others. And so it can still, you can do both, but it does involve a little bit of a kind of separation, the work you do on your own in terms of your own mind and the work that needs to be done from a compassionate stance towards others who are behaving in these ways.
Right. And that's a good point because I think on the surface, it might look like the same action, but a lot of times I'm doing what I'm doing, not out of altruism, but it might be out of anger, but it would still going to be the same kind of facade action that I would still have to take. It's just what's motivating me is frustration.
Right. I understand. And again, that's understandable. And that's something that any one of us would have, I'm sure. And Stella was a school teacher, so she knows from her experience, right? And Sarah was a teacher as well, yes. Right? So, I mean, maybe others in the room were teachers. So you know that, again, that's not something we can flip a switch. Like I said, you can't immediately change that type of behavior. But that's why, again, the work you do on the cushion can be, yes, examining your own, what came up for you, how you might have different thoughts at the time that will help you kind of inform the way that you say those things. That like you said, it might be the same things you say. It's just what is the motivation? What are the thoughts that guide you into doing that? So, very good example. Yeah, and that if you don't do that side of it, the side where you're actually attending to helping them to learn how to be more responsible and kind in the world, then that's doing a disservice to them and is going to lead them to engage in more behavior. Like you said, it becomes contagious. Everybody else starts doing it. It explodes if we don't address it. And that's not good for the children who are engaging in this, much less for others who will be on the receiving end of that. Yes, Mary Jo, online, we unmute and let's see what you have to share.
Hi. So
Hi.
it was a small thing come up this past week, but it like threw me to no end. And I'm sitting going, okay, what's going on? What's really going on in my mind? Why is this silly little thing bothering me? And I'm trying to look at my mind, and the mind is so sneaky. It was so difficult. And it was days of like, okay, what's really going on? So that inner work that you talk about, it's like, I don't, I'm, I want to do it, but sometimes it's like I sit down to do it, but then it's like that mind is so sneaky and and it hides. And
Yeah.
it's just sometimes such a challenge to do that inner work.
Well, and really, if we look at the fact that they often refer to this kind of distorted sense of self as the ego, which is a Western term, but in Buddhism we would say it's that self-centeredness and self grasping that is really very subtle and as you said, very tricky, very sneaky, and it doesn't want to kind of lose. It is really the part of us that wants to win and wants to be right and wants to put everyone else in their place and da da da. I mean, that's what's motivating so many of our actions, most of our actions. So essentially, that is going to be the biggest problem we have to tackle. We'll look at that in more detail a little bit later on in this text. But nonetheless, we have to start seeing the ways that it's manifesting, the ways that it's kind of in charge of the show and doing various things, and start there with those sorts of behaviors and those ways of looking at things. But doing the deeper work and getting to that kind of putting the ego in its place and really correcting that is a much harder job. But getting to know our minds is really the heart of Buddhist practice. If we don't do that, if we aren't attending to what's going on in our minds, then why are we practicing? We're just kind of giving lip service to Buddhism and not really doing the deeper work. I'll share a little phrase that Venerable Rabina has said in some of her teachings, and she told me that it was somebody else. Venerable Rabina, if you don't know her, is an amazing Australian nun in our tradition. She's been a nun for over 40 years, and she teaches very dynamically. But this phrase she said, I swore came right from her, but she said, no, I got that from someone else. She said, being a good Buddhist doesn't mean that you're kind of sitting there all serene, just kind of at peace and what have you. She says, being a good Buddhist means having your hands in your own shit. Sorry to use that word, but that's essentially what we're talking about. Getting our hands in our own stuff, saying kind of what is in there and how, gross and ugly and awful it can be to look at. But, you have to be able to do the work. And of course, the ego is going to want to hide and say, oh, no, I'm not that bad. No, everything is really okay, right? It's really nothing here. Keep moving, right? So, but that's the trick. We have to be able to kind of do that work and to be able to look at it and say, and own it and say, okay, this is my stuff. I am that way. I do have those things. And again, if someone is pointing that out to us or helping us to address it, which a lot of these verses revolve around, how wonderful. They're being like a perfect teacher for you. They're helping you to kind of see it when we oftentimes can't see it ourselves doing the work on our own. That's why we need spiritual teachers, particularly those who play that more formal role, but we even need these kinds of spiritual teachers who can teach us other things about ourselves. So we keep up the work and we try to keep investigating deeper, going deeper and deeper into our stuff, as awful as it is to look at. So. Okay, we're just about at 7 o'clock. I know, Stella, you need to leave a little early tonight. We usually take a break about now. Those of you who haven't been here before for a class, we usually take about a 10-minute break. And it gives a chance for people to talk. And there's some snacks over there that people are welcome to help themselves to. And then we reconvene and go till about 7:45, maybe a little bit after, and get everyone out of here a bit before 8 and what have you for sure. So let's go ahead and take a little 10-minute break. I have just about 7 o'clock right now. So I will pause the.
Good memory, John.
Everyone's joking with me about my memory, but there are holes in my memory. Trust me on that one. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to another verse. And if you do have some additional things to share, we'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end. We have another little section here. Actually, I think I had one more thing to share on verse 17. Let me go back to my slides. I like this little bit that Geshe Sonnen mentioned in his commentary. I think this is particularly appropriate in our day and age, even though this book was written in 1997. What is that, 30 years ago, practically? If we use our intelligence and abilities just listening to the news can act as a teaching and deepen our understanding. If we don't, it may simply fan the flames of prejudice or cause us suffering. I thought that was maybe some appropriate advice. Maybe it's a good fortune for a fortune cookie. Listen to the news as a teaching. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at verse 18. And we're in this section. Let me go to the outline where we have, we looked at ingratitude and derision. By the way, this outline has slightly different titles than the one that's in the text. We're now going into these two verses that I'll try to cover tonight yet. Transforming ruin, meaning kind of where you have poverty or things in your life that are really, really hard to bear because your life is falling apart, or things are not so good at all. And then the opposite, where you have prosperity, where you have wealth in your life. Because we have been mainly focused on the idea that we need to transform the adverse situations into a path. But as I mentioned quite a while ago, you are also advised to transform what is more beneficial in your life. Because remember, there are two sides, especially to this Tonglen practice, right? You have the taking the suffering of others. So when we're suffering and dealing with poverty and other issues, we can think about others who have the same type of problem or even worse problems, and we can visualize taking those problems away from them. But when we have something that's really delightful in our lives, good things happening, you get a check in the mail that you weren't expected, you have all this extra money and what have you, all these wonderful things. Well, then we can think about giving to others and maybe even physically give it to others, depending upon, what we have to offer. But this is like both sides of it. We work with the happy experiences to think about giving that happiness to others, and we work with the suffering experiences to identify the suffering of others and want them to be free of it. So this is, again, the other side of it. Both of these verses deal with the combination of happy experiences as well as suffering experiences. So let's go down to verse 18, which here was called carry troubles into the path. Though bereft of livelihood, always derided by people and afflicted by grave illness and even spirits. Tibetan Buddhists believe in spirits, these kind of beings who can maybe inflict some mental harm on us. But maybe the delusions do a good enough job in that. So we might not need to even believe in spirits, what have you, but there are forces, that can induce, certainly states of mind that are unhealthy for us. Still, it is a practice of conquerors' children to take all migrating beings' negativities and sufferings upon themselves and to not be discouraged. So the idea, he goes to the practice of Tonglen here and says, when you have your life goes to hell, essentially, when you are dealing with poverty, when there's derision and people putting you down, and maybe you're despised and looked upon in a really horrible way, and you're afflicted maybe by a grave illness or other things in your life that are really, really challenging to deal with. Well, that's the perfect opportunity to identify with the suffering of others, to actually say, okay, I'm experiencing this, but there are countless other beings who are experiencing the variety of sufferings as well. So once more, you use it as kind of, I use this phrase touchstone. I don't know if it's quite the right way to use it, but use it to touch upon, certainly, the suffering of others whenever you experience some suffering. And so here, we're talking about some pretty grave circumstances, but Venerable Thupten Chodron, who I mentioned earlier, she says that usually when this type of stuff happens to us, when we have something really severe happening in our lives that is really hard, we have two responses. And then maybe you have more than that, but the two common ones that she sees and hears from people are, first of all, getting really angry and upset at what's happening to you, right? You start flailing about and trying to blame everyone else in the world, right? And why is this happening to me? And da-da-da-da, and you really cannot kind of settle the mind because you're constantly upset by these things occurring to you. The second one, though, is kind of what she calls the pity party, which is, you hold a pity party for yourself, where you like go all around going, oh, this is happening to me, and look at how poor this is, I just feel horrible. You want other people to feel bad for you because you're going through such a tough time. And I can see where I've done both of those things in the past, right? I've gotten angry and upset that my life has suddenly gone to, to garbage, and I've gotten upset a pity party when I've had that happen as well, where I've been like, oh, I want to tell everybody in the world so that they all send me a card and, make me feel better, right? Well, yeah, neither of those patterns really does the trick, though. In fact, they might just keep our suffering kind of there in a much more tangible way, right? Because we keep that mind of anger and keep fanning the flames so that it just becomes more and more, deeper and deeper. And we just keep feeling more and more sorry because we try to milk at other people for all the kind of pity we can get from them. It doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't really help us to use it in a more constructive way. So that's the problem. She says, we usually wind up more unhappy and upset by following those two modes of the pity party or the angry upsetness. So she suggests that these feelings come from a sense of entitlement. Let me go ahead and share the screen where I've got a little phrase, a little quote from her book again. Don't believe everything you think, that book. It says here, behind our upset is often a feeling of entitlement. The universe owes us something. The world should treat us better. We may talk about karma, which we've touched on a little bit already tonight, but karma is that operative principle by which we create the experiences that we have. It's our stuff that we created in the past that we're now experiencing. So she says we may talk about karma, but when we go through hard times, we don't think that it is the result of our own actions. Instead, we continue to blame someone or something outside. That's because, once more, that is our habitual tendency. And I'm not saying, again, that we don't need to put any attention on the outside. There are times when people are engaged in behavior, which were like in the example of the children in Louis' classroom, where you might need to do something to address that type of behavior, not out of anger or any of these states of mind, out of a genuine concern for these beings who are doing that, because you see they're hurting themselves and hurting others through that type of behavior. But you, again, don't react from those more habitual places. You try to reframe everything in terms of, something that you created, something that is a lesson for you. I used that quote from Pema Chodron a few classes ago where she says, karma is life giving us the lessons we need to learn, essentially. So as it says there, instead of blaming someone or something outside, say, this is my karmic mess. This is a mess I've created and I need to learn from it. I need to work with this. She carries on in the next slide. It says, if we thought about karma, we would see, well, I'm going through a hard time due to the ripening of destructive karma I created. Well, how did I create this karma? What does it have to teach you? Well, it's no doubt coming from the root causes of self-centeredness, the ignorance. It's guiding the whole show. Again, we'll talk more about that in the future, the strong sense of a self, I, the ego that we're grasping at. It comes from our own attachment to having comfort and wonderful things in our lives. It comes from hostility that we have towards beings who interrupt that or interfere with that. All of these things have occupied our minds. Lacking what I need is the result of stealing, for example. We saw that earlier with the verse of stealing. Being disparaged is the result of speaking harshly and using my speech to create disharmony. Being afflicted with dangerous sickness and spirits is a result of physically harming others or deliberately causing them mental and emotional tumult. So again, all of the things that we experience are the result of doing these towards others. Now I'm experiencing the result of the causes I created under the influence of my own self-centered mind. Well, what use is it to become angry at others or to feel sorry for myself? The pity party and the, mind of anger, none of these do any good when we actually can use this as a valuable learning experience and say, okay, this is what's befalling me right now. I must have created the causes for this. Take ownership of it. Don't beat yourself up. I know we have that tendency in our culture to think guilt then. We start feeling horrible about it. So I must be a really horrible person if right now I've created the causes of me to have cancer and to have no money in the bank and all the various things that you might be experiencing. That's not the way to look at it, kind of beat yourself up and think you're horrible. It's to say, okay, this is what I created through the force of my crazy deluded mind. How do I uncreate it? How do I maybe, again, create the causes for something different? Maybe I can't reverse that karma completely. It is true that once karma sort of ripens into a result, it's often very difficult to reverse that entire result, but you can learn from it. You don't have to rail against it with anger or again, make it into a pity party because it's happening. You can actually say, okay, what do you have to teach me? What is it that I can do differently now so that my future experiences are different? Because again, this is why karma is such a central issue in Buddhism, really hard for us to get our heads around. Going to be a little discussion on karma, we think. That's the topic that's being batted around a little. I'm going to be gone. I won't be up here next Thursday. By the way, next Thursday it'll be online. I don't know, you're not going to open the gauntlet for everyone. You are going to open the gauntlet. So if people want to come and watch me on the screen, I'll be down in Santa Fe because I need to leave from the Albuquerque airport the next morning. And so I didn't want to drive all the way up here and then drive all the way down to Albuquerque next morning. So, but anyway, there will be the following Thursday. Eloise is contemplating posting a little discussion on karma. Kind of it's a very controversial topic in some ways. And in the West, we interpret karma in a very strange way, thinking it's really only applicable when people do bad things, like, oh, they're getting their karma now because of the horrible things they said about somebody else. Now somebody's saying something about them. That's one aspect of karma, but it's really very, very limited. Karma is the operative principle of cause and effect involving sentient beings and what they experience. So the good stuff you experience is a product of your own good karma. And of course, as was being pointed out by Venerable Doten Chodang, now she says, that we think we're sort of entitled to everything being good. That's the mindset we have. We don't think that there are causes and conditions for why we have good things in our lives. We think that's what we're due as human beings. Think, you're supposed to be born with a certain level of comfort and safety and all what you need to live a good life. And that if it isn't there from the beginning, it's almost supposed to be given to you or something. It's all something we create. It's through the force of our own actions that we have these things in our lives. So it's a very different worldview in Buddhism than it is in, say, Christianity or what have you, of theistic traditions. You are the creator of your own experiences, which is very empowering. When I first started teaching on karma, I used to say, karma is the teaching you need to learn that you need to get out of the back seat and get into the front seat and actually drive the car. And then after I thought about it, I said, no, really, you've been driving the car the whole time. You just didn't know the rules of the road or didn't know you were doing that. So you are a somewhat lousy driver. I mean, we all have been lousy drivers going from life to life with horrible situations and never really moving forward because we're stuck in that mode of not recognizing that we're the ones making the decisions and thereby experiencing the results. So when you have that, it's really empowering. It's meant to be liberating to hear the teachings on karma. You all can discuss this when you get together, but it's when we hear it initially, we think, oh, God. I remember when I first told my father about karma, because I'd been at some teachings on this topic, and he said, what did you do this weekend? And I said, oh, this really interesting class on karma. This is back in 1997, I think, when I was pretty new in my practice and just learning about some of these topics. And I explained it to him as best as I could. And my dad goes, oh, wow, I'm glad I don't believe in that. It's a little scary to think that you're in the driver's seat, that you're creating all of this yourself, right? But it's also very liberating. It's also like, okay, well, then I know what I need to do to have an effect on what I experience. And it's very clearly laid out. The teachings on karma say, yeah, you do these particular actions, not treating others with respect, harming them, and so on. Guess what? You're going to experience unfavorable things in your life. If you do things that are a benefit to others, treating them well, being generous and kind to them, protecting their lives and their property and so on, then you have that same type of result yourself. Very simple in idea, but very complex in terms of how it all plays out. And it doesn't immediately show itself to us, and it's very hard to have any sort of proof of karma. But as Venerable Rabina, who I quoted already tonight, she always says, use it as a working hypothesis. Say, okay, this is how I'm going to see how I live my life. I'll engage in these positive actions and see what effect it has over time on my experiences. And there's an effect on our experience right from the beginning when we start doing more virtuous things, which is we're essentially happier beings because we're not so involved in harming others. We're not doing things that are going to cause them pain and suffering. It's already quite liberating. But you will see the karmic ramifications over time of things falling into place because you've chosen that path of attending to your karma and abandoning the stuff that leads you to unfavorable situation. So going back to this verse that we're looking at, we see that this is really giving us this understanding for when you have those things in your life. If you are experiencing any of these things or any other type of troubles or, bad fortune, what might be called, then again, see it as an opportunity to learn from it and to actually say, well, what can I change now on the basis of the fact that this is what I created in some other lifetime. And I have a choice now to not create it again. So let's look at Geshe-Jampa Gyatso's commentary. He says, whether you're without wealth, resources, and so forth from the beginning, or having had them in the past, they were stolen by enemies and others, or maybe, the market caved and you lost all of your money, all your wealth, or having been exhausted, you, in short, have become bereft and destitute, even of the mere food and clothing that are conditions sustaining life. And maybe that hasn't happened to you at that degree, but anytime we've had any sort of huge impact on our well-being, financially, physically, what have you, it's a similar situation. And then he goes on to say, but not only that, at all times you are derided and slandered by all people, and in addition to that are afflicted by great illness, such as leprosy and so forth. Again, we don't have so much leprosy in the United States, but in parts of Asia, it's still very prominent. And by vicious spirits, such as the spirits above and the rest. Again, I can't speak to the spirits, but I have a healthy regard for Tibetan Buddhism. And so if there are these kind of malevolent forces, again, if you create the karma to have some interference in your life from them, then that's understandable that you would experience that. So again, in whatever these situations are, whether it's caused by these various things or whatever is going on, if you're dealing with some sort of troubles and ill fortune, bad fortune in your life, he says, however, even though you suffer intensely, inferring from the fact that you yourself are tormented by suffering, you should still take upon yourself all the negativities and sufferings of all migrating beings, all beings in samsara, by the force of compassion, thinking, how can I bear that others are tormented by suffering? Use your suffering to identify with the suffering of others and to act courageously without even the slightest mental discouragement or shying away that wonders, how could I bear such troubles, misfortune, illness, and spirits? Such is the practice of, again, the Bodhisattvas, the conqueror's children, the Buddha's children, of the way we carry suffering and troubles into the path. So this is the idea behind it, is that with an understanding that we've created this, and that, of course, this is the mechanism by which all beings create their own suffering, well, then we have compassion for others. Because the reality is whatever knowledge we gain in this life and an ability to understand the way things work, which again is the Buddhist view of the way things work, I have great confidence in it myself, but nonetheless, that's something that most beings don't even have. If we look at others and we understand that they're going about their lives, again, with blinders, it's like they are in the driver's seat, but they're bad drivers. They don't have any idea of the rules of the world. They don't have any idea of how to use this life to make the proper decisions, to engage in virtue, to abandon non-virtue. Well, then they're objects of compassion for us because they're experiencing their suffering, in a sense, needlessly, if they only knew that truth. In Buddhism, we often talk about two forms of ignorance. One form of ignorance is the ignorance of karma. And there are many other forms of ignorance. These are the two main ones. Having an ignorance of karma means that you are going to make bad decisions. You're going to engage in actions that are going to lead you down a path of experiencing the varieties of sufferings, because that's what happens when we don't pay attention to our minds. We fall into those habitual patterns. We have anger, we have resentment, we have pride, we have jealousy, we have all these various things that just perpetuate our suffering. So having an ignorance of karma is really one of the worst things we can have, because that means that we don't know how we're going about even creating the causes for happiness and avoiding what will lead to suffering. The deeper level of ignorance is that misunderstanding of the sense of an I that I've alluded to and that we'll get to eventually in the text. But that's at the root problem. That's the real, what's driving the whole show is we think we are this individual, separate self that exists on its own as some sort of independent existence. And that isn't there at all. Kind of fabricating the whole show on the basis of a false sense of an I or a person. But the ignorance we need to first correct is just our ignorance of how things work in terms of cause and effect in the world around us. Again, it cannot be proven to you. The Buddha gave a lot of teachings on karma where he said, okay, this is what follows from this particular type of action. From his observation as a being who knows everything through the omniscient mind of a Buddha. That was his ability to share that in a very kind of example sort of way. And he gave general teachings about how karma works. But for us to understand it ourselves, we have to start framing our lives in that context and say, okay, this is in my life because I created the causes for that. Well, get kind of curious and go, well, then how did I do that? I may not have done it in this life, because again, Buddhism holds to countless other rebirths we've had. But then we go into an investigation of, if I did those particular actions, well, then what does that mean for me now? It means, first of all, stop doing those types of actions if you don't want to experience this type of suffering. And moreover, maybe engage in their opposites. So when we looked at the one around stealing, right, earlier on, where someone's stealing things from you, you're being robbed, you come home and your entire house has been pilfered, everything's gone. You look at that, your first framing of it is, wow, this is a karmic lesson for me. I must have created the causes through my own lack of respect for the property of others, maybe my even stealing, taking things from others that were not offered to me. I created the causes for this, to come home to an empty house. Well, then again, you have an understanding, framing it in that way, of what you need to do. You need to be very meticulous in not stealing from others, not taking anything that isn't offered to you, and protect the possessions of others. If you see something happening to his possessions, then do what you can to intervene in those situations. Help others to have that kind of safety and security in their own possessions that strengthens your commitment to having no kind of and no actions that are going to support that type of behavior of taking things from others that then gets experienced as loss, as people stealing from oneself. So again, this is what all these verses are about, is essentially pointing out to us the things we need to work on. And if you can, work with the advice that he mentions here of opening up your heart to the suffering of others at that time. And I know this happens with Buddhist practitioners, who are very accomplished. Like they go to the doctor and they hear the news that, they had a biopsy done and it's malignant and, they need to start treatments or what have you. Where the first thing they think about is others who are dealing with cancer at that time, who are maybe getting a similar diagnosis or who are going through the treatment or who have been dealing with it for many years, or whatever the case might be. Their immediate identification is with others. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, amazing being who was, he's behind us somewhere there, isn't he? I can't turn around completely. But anyway, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he's in the back wall there. You can see Rinpoche now. He had a stroke in April of 2011. And when he was taken to the hospital in Australia where this happened, his whole concern was about everyone else in the hospital. He was like, oh, I've got to do some prayers for these other people. I've seen these people as they came in, people in these rooms that were having, the casts on their legs or whatever, all the various sufferings that those beings are experiencing. His whole thing was on others. He wasn't sitting there thinking about, oh my gosh, I've had the stroke now. I've lost my ability to use my left side of my body and all the things that are the ramifications of that. He was solely focused on others because he developed his mind in that way. So anyway, I'm sorry I'm getting really wordy on this one, but this is something we really need to attend to, is because if we have that understanding and we are able to use it as an avenue to touch with the suffering of others, it deepens our compassionate commitment to their well-being. It deepens our practice of the path. It helps us to cultivate bodhicitta, this mind that aspires to benefit others. And, it helps us to eventually become a Buddha then for their sake and help them in even greater ways. So the companion to that one is carrying prosperity into the path. Got a few more minutes, we can cover at least part of this. Carrying prosperity into the path is the exact opposite in that now we're talking about when everything's wonderful. This is, of course, how we like life to be. But again, Lama Zopa Rinpoche says we should like our problems, we should like our illness and all the other things as much as we like all of this stuff. Though they are famous, venerated by many beings, and have attained wealth like that of Ashravana. Ashravana is the Buddha figure that represents wealth and prosperity. It's kind of the wealth god of the northern region or something. He's often depicted with like a mongoose that is spitting out jewels. Like he's just full of prosperity. So even if we have like this incredible wealth, maybe we should say they're like Elon Musk, in our modern day. If you have this incredible wealth, like somebody who's a trillionaire or a billionaire over a million times over or whatever, see the essencelessness of the glory and prosperity of existence. It is the practice of conqueror's children to be without conceit, to not let it go to your head when things are going well. When suddenly, again, you do have some unexpected check and some payout, and you've got more money than you thought. You have this feeling of kind of feeling good about yourself. And you might even want to take credit for those things. Yes, you did create the karma for that, but don't think again that that was created entirely on your own. It involved your own past generosity and what have you. Many beings were involved in creating your wealth. So we don't want to get conceited, and instead we want to see the impermanent nature of all these things. We saw this way back in one of the earliest verses of this text, where Tokmei's uncle reminded us of impermanence. This is one of the most important teachings the Buddha gave, and we all understand it to some degree, but accepting it and understanding it are two different things. Impermanence refers to the fact that everything changes moment by moment. And by that everything, we mean everything that is conditioned in our world. We look at our own bodies, we don't like to think our bodies are constantly changing, but we're reminded all the time when we look in the mirror, we see a picture of ourselves posted on Facebook from 30 years ago, and we go, hey, I looked like that. I look so much worse now, or whatever. We have those kinds of thoughts, right? Because it's always changing all the time. This is one of the most fundamental truths that the Buddha spoke to. And of course, we have grosser levels of impermanence, like when death happens, when this life comes to an end. But even throughout this life, our minds, our bodies, the world around us, constantly changing. Well, even these wealth and other things that we have that we see as favorable and that we like having in our lives, guess what, folks? It doesn't stick around forever. And even when you get to that gross impermanence of death, you're going to have to leave it all behind. It's essenceless in that way. It's not really something you can rely upon. And even look at people who've gone from, maybe they started off really really poor and worked their way out of that type of life into like having unbelievable resources and wealth. And then they fell from that through some mishap, something that happened, the business failed, and suddenly, or the business they invested in that was really booming, suddenly the technology changed and they're out of business because they haven't adapted to the change. And then suddenly they're back to a realm of poverty. It can happen like that for any of us. Maybe it happens daily for us in terms of sometimes we might gain something in one place and then we lose it in another and what have you. This is the nature of life, is that there's nothing you can really rely upon in those sorts of things. Fame, good reputation, we saw that mentioned in one of the earlier verses as well. Even again, the comfortable things that we have, that we enjoy in our life, wealth, enjoyments, all these things, you can rely upon those. And of course, if we look at a deeper level, we see that they're not really sources of ultimate happiness anyway. If you do have the good fortune of having a lot of wealth, having things that you feel that you're fairly prosperous and what have you, that's an opportunity to use those things really well. To be generous with them to others, to use your fame or your own good reputation, maybe to help others who are like people who are wanting to start a good project that will be a benefit to others. Well, then lend your name to them, help them, bring your friends who know you into the circle of supporting those people. There's a lot of things we can do in our daily life if we possess these things. In the traditional teachings on karma, it's even advised that you have some of these types of things in your existence as a human being. Why? Because you can then help others so much easier. If you don't have any wealth at all, well, then people come to you and they say, oh, I'm starving, I'm suffering, and I need some help. And you say, I'm sorry, I don't have anything I can offer you. In all honesty, you can say that to them. Well, that gives you can wish them well, and you can think about imagining sending them all sorts of wonderful stuff. But it's much better if you can actually do that for others. People who have wealth can do that for others. Yeah, and I'm not trying to be socialist about this or anything. That's can be a bad word in our culture. But the idea is that you really want to tend to others through the resources that you have. Think that you've been given the good fortune of having accumulated those resources, and karmically, it makes sense for you to use them in that way. Why? Because that's how you got them in the first place. The karma of generosity is undeniable. If you are generous with what you have in prior lives, it will ripen into resources in future life. That's how it works. If you are miserly in the life, well, then you're creating the causes not to have resources in the future because you're not engaged in the act of giving. So again, giving is a very powerful way for us to connect with others and for us to create this very positive kind of flow of wealth. I might mention just in closing before we finish this, that having some level of contentment with what we have is really important too. We do have this acquisitional mind that is in the West to a very large degree, right? But we think it's all about acquiring more and more things. I remember that bumper sticker that said, he who dies with the most toys wins, or something like that, which is a really strange way of looking at life, right? That all it's about is accumulating all these kinds of things that you can then do what with when you die. Do you win anything? No, you leave them all behind and you go on with all the negative karma you created in acquiring all those things. So you really have to be careful around this mind of acquiring and the attachment, the desire for more that comes with that, and find some space of contentment. The great master Nagarjuna, in his, I think it's in his letter to a friend, he said, contentment is the greatest wealth, because no one can take it from you. If you are content, it doesn't matter then, right? You know, they can take the resources and come home and find everything gone. They can take everything away from you, and you will be content because you don't need all those things for your kind of inner peace, your inner balance, your inner equilibrium. So again, these two verses are kind of interesting because they work with those contrasting things that we have of things going to hell and things being very wonderful and delightful. And they're both opportunities to practice. And as I said, with things going well, we can do what Tokmei Sangpo advises here, diminish our conceit and, see the impermanence of those things. But you can also, again, think of giving those things to others. If you're not able to physically give them, at least mentally give them. Think, okay, well, while I'm enjoying having this nice car or this nice meal or whatever, I'm going to think of others having equally good things in their life. So, any questions or comments on those verses? Yeah.
This is on the same line, but when we're talking about suffering and trying to understand the suffering of others, when you see like the disciple taking on the agony of the world, or you see a mother that's watching children suffer, and
Sure.
well, especially sometimes if they die, it's their loss as well, but the suffering for that other human being. But do you know what I'm talking about? The disciple taking, I don't know if that's a Tibetan, the disciple taking on the agony of the world, Gene. So much grief that he's just like in this little position.
I remember I've seen that.
Yeah. Is that karmic? Well,
in the sense that when one is making a conscious choice to do this, which again, what we're talking about in this practice of Tonglen is making a conscious choice to say, okay, I see you and your suffering and what you're experiencing, and I'm going to make the conscious choice to, in a sense, take that suffering away from you. And it's as if I'm feeling that suffering on your behalf so you don't have to experience it. It's kind of creating a new karma. It's a way of working with the situation that's at hand to change the mindset that normally wants to push that away and say, okay, that's your problem, that's your difficulty. I'm just going to stay over here and protect myself and not feel that. Instead, you're welcoming it in and you're saying, okay, I'm going to take that suffering into myself. The thing that's tricky about it is it's not meant to bring you to a place of despair, though, of kind of like what that being is feeling like just the burden of the suffering of the world on them, that they almost feel overwhelmed by it. It's more the idea that you almost feel more courageous because of that, because you are having that willingness to engage in something that is about the freeing them from that. That's what the Bodhisattva is working on, is develop the mind that is going to be continually motivated to free others from suffering, which is what a Buddha does. The Bodhisattva in training becomes the Buddha, who the job description of a Buddha is one line: to free all beings from suffering and place them in happiness. That's the full job description. And they do everything in their power to do that, given the limitations of beings being able to benefit from that. So essentially, when we're practicing Tonglen, or these types of meditations as a Bodhisattva in training, as someone's wanting to move in that direction, we're doing it to really strengthen our muscles of compassion and love and care and concern, and make them ourselves more and more courageous, so that we are willing to go through whatever it takes to benefit others. So it becomes more like a badge of honor. But they sometimes use this idea. It's strange. Buddhism is known for being quite peaceful, right? but they use a lot of war analogies. What happens on the battlefield, I've never been on the battlefield myself, is that sometimes when people see blood, it actually makes them more courageous. That they feel some response to that brings up a new source of going the extra distance, going further. It's a bit like that. Like when you're willing to take in the suffering that is happening, it makes you an even more courageous being. So I don't know if that's answering your question completely, but but that ideal of like somebody who almost feels kind of been burdened by the suffering of the world isn't quite what the Bodhisattva is aiming for.
It's not like an energy exchange where, you take someone's suffering on and
and then
guess,
you have that as like a burden to bear. It's not quite the same way, because remember what we're doing with this suffering we're bringing in is really to abolish the blocks we have in ourselves that keep us from being able to do that for others. The main one being our tendency to be very self-centered, to be very self-focused, to think of myself first and others, not so much, or certainly second. That's our tendency. That's what we call our self-cherishing or self-centered mind. When we take away that suffering, we even visualize kind of demolishing that mind at our heart, kind of getting rid of it. That's what we're trying to get rid of, is the obstacles that keep us from really being fully dedicated to the welfare of all beings, which is an extremely tall order. Don't get me wrong. I'm not making it sound like it's some sort of simple thing. This is why we have to do this constantly, and really work on it, so that we fake it till we make it, but eventually you will make it. Eventually it will feel so natural for you to respond to the suffering of others in that way. Just like Lama Zopa checking into the hospital, and all he can think about is all the other people who are in this place of suffering in the hospital, going through their own traumas and difficulties, and not think about his own suffering. So it becomes pretty selfless and courageous over time. It doesn't become a burden. In fact, again, I would think there's almost some joy to it. I didn't get a chance to talk about that little text, so I'll start next week with that. Let me introduce you to it briefly, and I'll put it out on the drive. You can take a look at it if you want. It's called How to Transform Sickness and Other Circumstances by our author, Gyaltse Tokme Sangpo. Tokme Sangpo is what we normally call him. But, he talks about if you get sick, well, I'll rejoice in being sick. If I'm healthy, well, then I'll rejoice in being healthy. And he goes on with a couple of other examples. But the idea is that you train your mind so that you have this kind of even keeledness with regard to whatever is happening, where you see it all as grist for the mill and not differentiating, oh, this is the good stuff, this is the bad stuff. It's all becomes something you can have some inner joy at just experiencing all of it and feeding it into your own kind of motivation on the path. So it is a very different mind, I think, than what you were referring to. Okay, I think we've done more than our share for tonight. Let's go ahead and thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. And all the other questions today. Let's go to the dedication list, and then we'll do the dedication prayers. I think Eloise is going to read the list. And if you have names to add at the end, please let us know.
So we dedicate the merit from listening to these teachings to all beings on all dedication lists everywhere, but specifically in our own people suffering obstacles. Matt, Carol, Jim, Jeff, Lisa, Alyssa, Jim, Bjorn, Jana, Diane, Jay, Hillary B, and Anne Marie. And those with illness: Diana, Susan, John, Jim B, Anne Marie, Jana, Paul B, and Lucille J. And those who've died recently: John, Jan, Margot, and Van Allen. Jan Allen, yes, from Van Allen. Jan Allen.
Thank you, Eloise, for reciting on. Any additional names that need to be added from anyone online or in the cockpit? Okay, so for all of those beings whose names were recited, as well as those who we've been asked to pray for or we've offered to pray for that we haven't included in that list, we dedicate for their welfare, that may be free from suffering, and find the causes that lead to true happiness. And may all beings have these same results through the power of what we've done here tonight. Let's conclude with our dedication prayers. We'll go to the first one here, and we'll just do this in English tonight. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And may the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And we do make prayers for our teachers, especially His Holiness, who we depend upon so much in this world. Just His presence, even though He's not teaching as much as He did when He was younger, His presence in this world is so important. So for Him and all the other teachers we have in our lives, we'll recite this prayer for their good health, long lives, and all their wishes to be fulfilled. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. So since Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it's been over 3 years since he showed that aspect of passing away, but his reincarnation apparently has happened according to the Dalai Lama, but we have not yet identified that child who will be the reincarnation of Rinpoche. So we're making prayers for that to happen as swiftly as possible, and for everything to be auspicious for that being to be of incredible benefit in this world. Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. So by the way, that prayer was written by His Holiness Dalai Lama for Rinpoche's return. So thank you all for being here tonight. Again, next week, just to remind you, you can gather here and watch me on screen. I'll be down in Santa Fe teaching from there. Feel free to join that way. But if you want to stay home and watch on screen, the link is on the website as well, and you can do that. And then the following week, hopefully this little discussion will take place here. Please come. It'll be a nice little way to talk amongst yourselves and engage in discussion about karma. And then I will return on September 10th. Yeah. Good. All right. Again, thank you all. Thank you all online. So good to see you all. Okay.
Thank you,
All
Don.
right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.